Everybody listen to We're Not Wizards, because we are the best, and we're not wizards, no matter what anybody says. Goodbye.
Feeling okay until I realised you're a doctor. So that means you've managed to persuade people that you're super intelligent, and I feel quite intimidated by that, because I think in certain spaces I think it's quite easy for me to blag myself as somebody who knows a little bit about board games, and what I'm actually very, very good at doing is getting people on who know an awful lot about board games, and I just know when to ask the right questions. So when I was faced with, obviously having a conversation with someone like yourself who is an academic, I must feel I've never been. I was less intimidated by Stephen Bonacore, knowing that he knew that I didn't like his game. So,
oh dear. Well, I guess I should preface this by saying that I'm not a real medical doctor, nor am I actually a doctor of game studies, although my research now, I guess I'd consider myself to be a game scholar.
Yes.
But my PhD is actually in atmospheric physics, so it's far removed. So don't worry, you're far more qualified than I am, Richard, for all of this.
So you're a fake. Yes, he's a fake. He's an absolute... No, that's fine. I feel better already. That's okay. I can look at the sound waves now. I'm like what's his face in The Matrix. He says, "I don't."
Neo,
yeah, you're Neo, and I'm the I'm the slightly.
You're the character Lawrence Fishburne plays.
No, I'm not even him. I'm the other one. Joe Pantalamo or whatever. The guy that says I don't even see the code anymore. I'm the kind of the sleazy Baldwin one that kind of does anything for a steak, which is pretty true, to be perfectly honest. So your official title, just getting this right. I'm actually having a clearing of the throat just to make sure I pronounce this correctly. It's Dr. Sam Illingworth, Senior Lecturer in Science Communication and Bowtie Studies. Is that correct?
It's exactly what I am and who I am. Absolutely.
We have to tackle the bowtie situation at some point in the conversation. You do realise that, not from a you understand, not from a kind of using it for light comic relief, because I'm assuming, and we don't have to do an intro here. I'm joined by, as I say, Dr. Sam Illingworth. Is it Illingworth or is it Illingworth? I never even. That's ridiculous.
No, Illingworth's perfect. You got it absolutely spot on.
That's good. I'm so pleased. I am actually. That sounded sarcastic. Let's start off with, I think, the most important question, which is: you are a man who sports a bow tie. Do you switch between elasticated and actual ones that you tie, or are you about if we were in the street, would you now be raising your glove to my face and slapping my face twice and going, "How dare you, sir? I tie these my very self"?
So I have a selection of bow ties that I can tie, and I know how to tie a bow tie, yes. But I mainly wear elasticated ones simply because the patterns that are available on the elasticated ones tend to be better. So it's just for sartorial reasons more than anything else. The reason I actually wear a bow tie is when I lived in Japan for a couple of years, and for some unknown reason, one of the first things I learned how to say, which I've forgotten now, is I wear a bow tie on a Friday to celebrate the weekend. And then it meant I had to wear a bow tie every Friday, and then it started being every day.
And so you actually learned the kind of the days of the week. So what we've discovered so far, because this is almost turning into like one of those sting operations, is that you don't actually always tie a bow tie, and your doctorate is going to hunt to do with games. You know, I'm just wondering what other...
Basically.
I was expecting...
Fake news.
Don't use
what
that.
It is.
I was expecting, you know, an academic discussion. I didn't realise I was going to be like that Dom, don't get done, get Dom guy. And you were like one of these plasterer boys that had only put up 2 sheets of plaster when you were supposed to put up 6. And you've got this crying old age pensioner in the corner who's saying, he promised me a proper bow tie. He promised me a proper bow tie, and then he was flicking out with his elastic. I'm kind of interested in a couple of things, because I'm interested in the area that you're in at the moment. Is obviously you said you're kind of getting into the kind of the academic side of kind of gaming, which I think is fascinating. We did have Holly Nielsen on the show probably a good 3-4 months ago, and she was talking. She's actually going ahead to study her PhD directly in the history of board games, and she was picking like a certain kind of time scale. So in terms of your involvement in the hobby, is where you are now, is it kind of like a happy accident? I mean, did you have a particular kind of career route kind of planned out when you first, I mean, what did you study first of all at kind of university?
Okay, so a brief potted history of myself. So I did an undergraduate degree in physics with space science and technology.
Right.
Then I did a PhD in atmospheric physics. But I was basically using satellites and aircraft and drones to make measurements of greenhouse gases at the Earth's surface.
Right.
But I was really interested in how to communicate science with non-scientists. And in particular, I was super interested in how theatre could be used to do that. So after my PhD, I went to Japan and worked in a Japanese theatre on a scholarship looking at the relationship between science and theatre. Then came back to the UK and then continued working on research aircrafts for a little while. And then what I was really passionate about was developing dialogue between scientists and non-scientists, and in particular giving voice to audiences that might be perceived as being traditionally underserved or underheard. And one of the ways in which I did that is through poetry. So my research really focuses around the use of poetry to enact dialogue between scientists and non-scientists. And then about 4 or so years ago, my colleague, Dr. Paul Wake, who's a reader in English at Manchester Metropolitan University, me and him got chatting. We realised we both had a massive passion about tabletop games, and we set up the Manchester Game Studies Network. And through the Manchester Game Studies Network, which is a collection of academics at Manchester Metropolitan University and other institutes across the world, people working on board game studies. And what I'm really interested in, and what Paul's interested in as well, is how we can use tabletop games to facilitate dialogue. So how we can use the space around the table and away from the table to enable people to have conversations. So really, this came about as an opportunity for Paul and I to work together, to find colleagues who had similar interests, and to use tabletop games as a facilitatory medium through which to explore our research. Obviously, we're huge board game fans. We have big board game collections as well. And then through this process, as well as doing research into it, Paul and I have also started to design games. And I guess the tagline we kind of have in the games that we design are, we make games that start conversations. So the idea was to move away from games that are traditionally labelled as edgy games, which, nobody actually wants to play of their own volition. No. And instead to make games that are fun and that are games for game's sake, and that actually rather than having like reams of text that people read off the cards or flavor text that nobody reads, it's actually through playing the game and through the mechanics of the game that specific information is conveyed and dialogues can start to take place. So that's how we've ended up doing research, and we've been really, really fortunate as well. So Paul and I also have a column in Tabletop Gaming Magazine called "Play It Smart, Not Our Choice," in which we talk about, we talk about games from an academic perspective, but really what we try to do as well is to it sounds quite a lofty aim, but we're really trying to break down those ivory towers that people associate with academia and say, look, research can be fun as well as being insightful, and just try to offer something a little bit different about for people to consider when they're playing tabletop games. So that's where we now find ourselves.
That's a lot to unpack, as you would say. And there's certain parts I'm going to let you off with, and there's certain parts that I have to dig in deeper. I'm interested as being, as you could probably, anyone could guess, I used to do a bit of theatre. But in terms of what you're talking about with what you were doing in Japan, was that kind of like the Brian Cox style of kind of demonstrating certain, or was
absolutely not?
What were you doing then? Because I'm now fascinated. Were you actually writing kind of like semi-dramatical representations, or what were you actually doing?
That's exactly what I was doing. So really? I was working at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and I was working with students, teaching them how they can use theatrical technique to develop effective communication skills, but then also working with them to write dramas that they then took over to China to look at the relationship between Chinese and Japanese students. At the same time, I was also doing work experience with Yukio Ninagawa, the famous director, and basically just sat watching Cymbeline and other Shakespearean plays being performed in archaic Japanese and understanding about 1 in 200 words. But it was certainly an experience.
It's no different from normal Shakespeare. I mean, my take on Shakespeare is I've always believed that Shakespeare in school has fundamentally been taught completely incorrectly, and that it is almost like it's trying to teach somebody how good something tastes by getting them to read a recipe 50 times and then expecting that person to fully appreciate the mixture of flavours and how it hits the palate and the consistency on the tongue and how they feel once they've eaten the thing. And I think one of the way that Shakespeare had an impact on me as a younger person was that one of the English teachers was, they were quite a little bit forward thinking, and we were doing the Merchant of Venice, and they said, okay, they could tell that the class weren't taking it in. It's what, for anyone that's not read the Merchant of Venice, and I don't blame you for not, because it's as usual with normal Shakespeare, it's pretty inaccessible unless you actually see it. But they decided to roll in. And this is what you used to have in high schools. You used to have a videotape player that used to roll in on a stand with a big, huge TV. And they sat down and they put on I think it was the BBC adaptation of The Merchant of Venice. I think it was with, was it Warren Mitchell playing Shylock? And that blew me away. Actually seeing the characters kind of interact. It had... I don't know if you've seen it, but it had John Nettles in it as well. Bergerac.
Oh wow! Yeah, of course. And Midsummer Murders. Who could forget John Nettles?
Who could forget? I never watched the Midsummer Murders because he would always going to be Bergerac to me. But to me, that was kind of like that. What that did, that demonstrated to me that this was the pure beauty of seeing Shakespeare, was actually seeing it kind of portrayed in front of you. And I remember going and seeing Macbeth or the Scottish, well, it doesn't matter, I can call it don't have to call it the Scottish play because I'm not treading the boards, but it was kind of like seeing that and the dramatic effect you could kind of have on people and how it could kind of influence them, where if they read it on the page, they were just like, I don't care how hoarse the raven is, you know, not really that fussed. You know, don't really care. I mean, she likes to wash her hands, you know, doesn't everybody? It's a bit of a germy environment out there. But was that what you were trying to elicit? Was it kind of communication, emotional responses and stuff like that between people in terms of levels of communication? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think just, you know, trying to get students who are thinking about being prospective scientists, that just because they wanted to do science didn't mean that they have to be restricted to only doing science, and that, you know, that they shouldn't be put into boxes that other people label, but rather they should be free to express themselves in a variety of different art forms and hobbies and other areas that they're interested in.
Yeah. When with the stuff that you're kind of doing now, I mean, you said you've got quite a large collection. Did you take the time to kind of look at them and study them kind of from an academic point of view as well then? I mean, have you got the ability, you'll have the ability just to sit down and enjoy a game, but also because of what you're kind of getting involved in now, and we will go into it, do you sometimes look at stuff from a kind of a critical point of view and saying, well, where I could use this game doing this, or I could use this mechanic kind of doing that?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, I think with several of the games that we play and talk about in our column, for example, we'll try and do like a critical read of them. But I think Paul and I both, when we play games, and Paul comes from an English background, so he's far more intelligent than I am in terms of critically reading things. But I guess when we're looking at games and playing them, there's very much this thing of, oh, this is a really nice mechanic, or this has got a really nice theme attached to it. Is this something that we could then start to use in a classroom environment, or start to use in a public engagement setting to start to elicit conversation around? I mean, the perfect example would be terraforming Mars. So, you know, as soon as we played that, we were like, oh, wow, this is such a cool game to start people having a conversation around what it would actually be like to terraform Mars. So we you know, after playing that for a couple of times, we reached out to the Institute of Physics, and then we ran a couple of training sessions in which we used the game as a segue to conversation. And what was really cool about that game was that, you know, it's so well researched and it's so beautifully put together in terms of the mechanics, but it's not just reading the flavor text. It's actually when you play the game, you kind of realize that terraforming Mars is really, really hard. So why on earth would you want to terraform Mars? And then it makes you think, why are we investing all of this money in potentially terraforming Mars when instead we could be using it to save our planet? You know, so like having those conversations are really, really cool, that can come out of just playing a game that has a really intricate mechanic. And I guess sometimes when we play games, we think to ourselves, okay, you know, Terraform Mars again being a good example, this is a game that for like people who have played lots of games before isn't particularly complex. You know, it's, you know, a worker placement game to all intents and purposes, but like an engine builder. But if you're somebody who's never played games before, it probably is quite overwhelming. So what we try to think about is, okay, how can we modify this game to make it accessible so that people who have never played games before can do it? And what we found with Terraforming Mars is, if you play it as a 4-player game, but rather than using 4 players, you have 8 and people double up. It's a really cool way to then enable people to like use the downtime to plan their next move and to elicit further conversation as well. So I think something that Paul and I have got really good at is looking at games that already exist, commercially off the shelf available games, and thinking, how can we make slight modifications or changes to those in order to take it to an audience that's maybe never played a game before, or maybe thinks that tabletop games are Monopoly or Ludo, and introduce them to this whole new world instead. So I think in terms of a critical eye, that's maybe something that I definitely do more of now than I used to do in the past.
in terms of kind of changing games, one of the things that, you were kind enough to send me kind of a link over to one of the kind of the studies you were involved in, which was the use of Catan and creating almost like generating an expansion for Catan, which took into account kind of like the environmental impacts. And I'm just interested to find out kind of what made you decide. I mean, obviously Catan itself is seen as one of the stable games, that most people who get into the hobby will certainly be aware of it, if not, have at least played it. But what was your thoughts behind kind of taking something like Catan and kind of trying to kind of start off what you said, you enabling the conversation regarding the effects of, this on the environment and things like that?
Absolutely. So I think Paul and I wanted to use a game that worked as a game, that was well established by the gaming community, and that would have a appeal. And obviously Catan's a bit of a some people love it, some people hate it, right? But it's got a really, really great mechanic, and also it's a game that people play and you think to yourself, okay, we're using resources, and there's just limitless resources. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to make a game in which there isn't a limited resources, and so we introduced various mechanics that change it and that actually tie it into the more resources you use, the more you're maybe potentially increasing the effects of global warming over the Catan island. And so it then becomes a very different game in which players have to trade off with each other whether or not they're going to for example, instead of taking wood or wood or wool or lumber or whatever, players can choose to overmine that area, so they get 2 resources instead of 1, or 4 resources instead of 2, right, if you've got a city. Or they can choose to leave it fallow, in which case they don't take any resources, but the risk of the environment warming up goes down slightly. So it becomes this really nice, semi-collaborative game, actually, in a way. And, there's a really nice mechanic in the game where either, if it gets to a point where the game ends because of global warming, either nobody wins or the person with the most victory points at that point wins. But that's something you have to decide at the very start of the game. So that introduces further conversations as well. So, and I'd really encourage, your listeners to check out that game. You can get it for free as a print and play on the Manchester Game Studies Network website. Okay. And it was, it was really great developing that. We wrote off to Tauber just to say, look, are we okay to do this and everything? And Catan have got a really good fair use policy, so they were really happy about that. Yeah. And it was a great experience. And what we're doing now is we're going to try and conduct even more research into, okay, so just how effective has that game been potentially at developing dialogue? Because the print and play game's been downloaded and played about 2,500-3,000 times, so it's done fairly well. But what's really, really interesting now is to see if that's actually having an impact.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a case of seeing if it's been actually used in kind of academic circles and teaching circles as well. I mean, in a general point of view, and I'm aware, obviously, the continual politics of this, entire situation. Are you still very surprised that, in the year 2019 that we're still having, it's not a case that we're having the discussion about how do we deal with this potential climate, the potential change in climate, which, today has been unbearable, but we're actually still having to have the conversation where we're actually needing to have arguments with people. And I don't mean shouting at them, though you feel like shouting at them sometimes, that this is actually a thing, that there's people that are still kind of denying it.
So I think it's a really interesting question. So there's a study literally came out this week, which looked at scientific consensus for anthropogenic climate change. So that is, to what extent were scientists convinced that climate change or the climate catastrophe is human-made? Yeah. And 99% of all scientific studies ever published on climate change, which, into the tens of thousands, agree that it is anthropogenic.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is a figure that's been above the 90s for the past decade or so, longer than that. So it's something that scientists have always known. Now, the problem is, and I guess where part of my research in science communication comes, is that scientists aren't always great at having a conversation about stuff. And we know as a fact that actually, just because people possess facts doesn't mean that they're able or willing to make lifestyle choices to reflect upon that. So in terms of communicating climate change, what we really need to be doing, the climate catastrophe, what we need to be doing much more is, as scientists, we need to be listening to non-scientists, listening to their needs, listening to their experiences, listening to their knowledge, and using that as a way to help us to frame how we talk about climate change. Now, the climate catastrophe is a global interdisciplinary problem that is going to affect everybody.
Yes.
It's not just going to affect scientists. And because of that, we need to have solutions that come from everybody, not just scientists. It's arrogant of scientists to assume that they're the only ones with the answers. And it's lazy of non-scientists to assume that only scientists are going to be able to have a say. Mm. Now, unfortunately, science for many, many years creates a barrier, either perceived or real, in which people feel as though they're not welcome to express their opinions, their needs and their experiences, which we know to be absolute baloney. And we know we could take only someone like, for example, Greta Thunberg. Like, she's not a scientist, like she hasn't got a doctorate, but she's done more than I will ever achieve in my entire life in terms of pushing forward the agenda and making a positive impact on the world in which we live. And so we need to ensure that everybody has this voice. And we also need to remember that often some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people, through no fault of their own, are the people that have the lowest impact on the climate catastrophe.
Yes.
And yet they are the people that are going to suffer the most from it.
Yes, yes.
So why aren't we listening to their needs and their experiences? And what we propose, what Paul and I propose, is that games are actually a really, really powerful way of starting people to have that debate and creating a safe space around a table in which people can start having topics of conversation. And it's not just saying, you know, climate catastrophe is bad, stop flying. It's we need to talk about this. We need to work out the levels of perception. There was a study done 3 years ago at the Yale Climate Lab, which looked at how many Americans, and I'm not picking on America, it's just this is where the study was done, how many of them thought global warming was real. It was over 70%, not bad. How many of those people thought global warming would affect the US? 50%, not great. Yeah. How many of them thought that it would affect them personally? 40%. Yeah. How many of them thought that how many of them had a conversation at least occasionally with their friends or colleagues? 33%. Yeah. So if only a third of the population are talking about the problem, then how are they going to possibly solve it? So, you know, this thinking was really very much behind the current game that Paul and I have been developing, called Carbon City Zero. And this is a game that we've been developing with the climate charity 1010 Climate Action, and which launches in Kickstarter in the beginning of September.
Oh, okay.
And in this game, it's basically a deck builder, a bit like Dominion or Star Realms. And what you're doing is you are the mayor of a city and you are racing to become the first city to be carbon zero, to have zero carbon emissions. And, you know, you start off with pretty dodgy cards like poor housing stock or remote properties, but then you can improve your deck as you go along. And the idea behind this game is, you know, there's no flavor text on the cards, but the game, in order to succeed at the game, there's several strategies, but one thing you have to be able to do is you have to interface between industry, housing, and local government. And so through playtesting, and we've playtested it with policymakers, with community groups, with students, with other members of the public and various publics, the thing that's come across is that one of the messages that's clear is that, so in order to do this, we can't work in isolation. We need to work together. No. And for me, that's a really powerful learning outcome to be able to come from playing a game.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's become a polarised, politicised, kind of tagged on agreement kind of thing, isn't it? On certain sides of the political spectrum, if you're on that spectrum, then disagreeing with what's happening with climate change is kind of like is almost like it's tagged alongside everything else, like free healthcare for everybody, or free education for everybody, or kind of social housing for people. So it's unfortunately, rather than it becoming something which is kind of centralised, it's almost a case that if you are one of these, if you're somebody that's like, well, this is something we need to sort out, you seem to have been politicised, to being put on the left. And I don't know if that is because in America, there's the political landscape is generally about kind of lobbying, and that the coal, oil industries have a massive pull in government, so policies that are coming through are generally coming through on the Republican side of the House. And therefore, the polarisation that's happening in America at the moment almost puts people who are, it's like, if you help save the planet, you're going to destroy the economy, which to me is an absolutely crazy concept. But there you go. And it's actually changed, because I remember, and you'll probably remember this as well, is that the whole CFC thing, when the ozone layer kind of thing kind of first kicked off. And it was like, look, there's this huge hole in the ozone layer, and we need to ban these chlorofluorocarbons. Try saying that 5 times fast. But it just seemed to be a case of everybody downed their tools and went, oh my goodness, if this is happening, that's it. And it was almost a case absolutely. Of CFCs. Yeah. It was unit.
Well, the Montreal Protocol, which, basically put a stop to CFCs, is a perfect example of how effective science policy can cross political lines and actually be very, very beneficial. Mm-hmm. But, this comes back to the whole thing about people's needs, people's experiences, people's behaviours. There absolutely needs to be a need to depoliticize the climate catastrophe. But one of the ways you can go about doing that is by talking to people about, their experiences, about the things that they love, about nature, but also focusing on the positive elements of things rather than constantly giving people negatives to focus on. Because what we find through climate communication research is giving people negative attitudes, what it does is it disables them from actually taking action.
Yes.
So instead, a far more powerful thing is to get people to think about an element of nature, think about an element of the environment in which they love, in which they enjoy spending time, like a favourite canal or a favourite walk or a favourite park. And then just think about what would happen if that wasn't there anymore. And, that's a far more powerful way of doing it than telling people and berating people to behave a certain way. But the most important thing is to have a conversation and to be talking about it, and to be talking about it openly. And, coming back to games again, not just for the climate catastrophe, but for many, many subjects, games offer that really powerful way for you to be able to have a discussion about things. And, like I said, creating this safe space in which you're around a table, you can, do things to players that you wouldn't normally do in the real lives, but, backstab them or cheat or trade with them, whatever. And it just creates this environment that's incredibly conducive to conversations and to meaningful exchanges of dialogue.
Yeah. And I think people need to be having a conversation, even if everybody got round the table and basically said, well, yeah, actually, I don't know if there is anything that we can do. We're just going to have to kind of rough ride it out kind of thing. But I think we need to kind of distance ourselves away. I mean, the other thing that I see is, don't buy any more plastic water bottles. And people go, okay, yeah, I won't. And look, here's me doing my bit, not buying plastic water bottles. And then you'll get somebody underneath, rather than congratulating them and saying, great, you've bought like a kind of a multi-use glass bottle instead that you're going to be using to store water in. They're saying, well, that's not going to stop the plastic bottle manufacturer from continuing to make 10,000 bottles a day. And you're just like, we kind of need to move away from that, because that's then making that person saying, well, what's the point in me actually taking any action at all? And I totally agree with you. We need to make it kind of positive and make people feel that they're kind of contributing at the same time. From you playtesting the game, has that put kind of other topics that you can kind of gamify as well? I mean, obviously, you're talking about in general kind of scientific kind of communication, but as it gives you a raft of ideas to think, well, kind of what else can we do? How else can we help kind of bridge the gap here and kind of get more people involved in kind of general kind of scientific discussions as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to give away all of our future design ideas, but
just
basically,
just whisper.
No, but it also is just, most times we play games, I think we think to ourselves, okay, well, this is a great hook for talking about a contentious topic. Mm-hmm. So, for example, games would be a fantastic way to start talking about, like, genetically modified food or something like that. We could, or like the issue of soil degradation, mm-hmm. have a huge game of agricola and start, talking about, look how complex agriculture and farming is and how many different elements are involved here. Now, what would happen if we modded this game to have a GM component in agricola? Or what would happen if we modded this game to have a component in which, unless you had a certain amount of wildflowers being planted every year in fallow seasons, then the soil would degrade. Mm-hmm. And so, you can make these like small modifications to already existing games that make them really powerful, not just learning tools, because learning implies like a one-way direction, but, these powerful tools for conversation. And that's what, for me as an educator and as a communicator and as an academic, really appeals to me about tabletop games, because they're so easily modifiable, and I don't necessarily have to design a game from scratch in order to start these conversations. I can go and pick a game off my shelf, and then, there's a game that's borders on most topics that we can start to have a think and a chat about. And that's some of the really interesting work that we do, mm-hmm. which is when we work with other academics to pick games from our games library or order games in specifically that we can then start to use in those teaching and learning environments to have real conversations. So, for example, we worked with a colleague in microbiology, and we were really, really interested in talking about antimicrobial resistance. And one of the big things about antimicrobial resistance is that, and again, not to patronize, but a lot of people don't know that antibacterial, drugs only work on diseases caused by bacteria. They don't work on diseases caused by viruses. Yeah. So it's really important getting people to realize that there's different types of diseases. Some are caused by viruses, some are caused by bacteria, some are caused by parasites, some are caused by fungi. And we wanted to have a game that enabled people to start talking about this. And, the first game that comes to mind is Pandemic, right?
Yeah.
But then the cool thing about Pandemic, which is apart from being a brilliant game, is it's got all these great expansions. So Pandemic Iberia doesn't just have generic disease 1, disease 2. It actually has diseases that exist in the real world. So cholera, malaria, typhoid. So these are diseases that some of which are caused by bacteria, some of which are caused by viruses, and some of which are caused by parasites in the case of malaria. So it's a really, really cool game to get people thinking about, all of these diseases are this. And then in Pandemic Iberia, because it's set in the 1800s, you can never actually cure the disease. You can only stop it spreading. Yeah. And one of the ways that you can do that is by making sure that you have a lot of purified water. So that sends a really powerful message about how important cleanliness is, and, about how, rather than being reactionary, preventative measures are far more effective in fighting disease than drugs after the fact. And then the great thing about Pandemic Iberia is that, and Pandemic in general, is that it really demonstrates that this whole process isn't just a single scientist in a lab, right? It's also logistics specialists, it's researchers, it's town mayors, it's nurses, it's railwaymen. It's a really cool game for demonstrating how real research isn't just the preserve of scientists, but requires a meaningful collaboration with people from all aspects of society working together in collaboration. And that just comes from a game, a really cool game that brilliant game designers have done and which people enjoy learning. But then we know that when we talk to them afterwards about their experiences and what they felt from playing the game, it conveys these really powerful messages about cooperation and then in this instance, about antibacterial resistance and how different diseases can spread as well.
Yeah, I think, I think the joke, not the joke at the moment, but one of the things is the next version of Pandemic going to have, anti-vaxxers as a potential kind of source of, you draw a card, you
That's
get
really
an epidemic.
You could have a betrayer mechanic, right? You could have a betrayer mechanic of anti-vaxxers in there.
It's pretty much like a Dead of Winter kind of thing, where everybody
exactly
kind of
right. Dead of Winter crosses Pandemic.
Exactly. Yeah.
There you go. Trademark it. Done.
Exactly. There we go. That's us now. 1,000 years until we get sued, and we both kind of lose our kind of our houses. One of the things that seems to be becoming a discussion point again and again is that, and you see them on Kickstarter all the time, and in fact you see them in a lot of expansion boxes. In fact, normally when you get a game, there's some components of this involved, which is the plastic components of board games. And, I'm not going to single out kind of Kickstarters with, they do have a lot of kind of minis and stuff like that, which are obviously all plastic, which are going to be there probably long after people have stopped, potentially playing them. Do you think that's a conversation that the board game industry maybe needs to have with itself, to actually say, well, this is all fantastic and great, but one of the things that we're kind of being mindful of is we are helping huge amounts of plastic getting manufactured in China, getting shipped over here, and then it is going to be here in kind of perpetua. I've noticed a couple of conversations. I think Ross from More Games Please has recently brought up a couple of issues regarding packaging and being sent kind of expansions which were in a massive box with the actual expansion itself. I know that I watched the Shut Up and Sit Down. I watched Quinn's doing his review of Too Many Bones, and one of the things he highlighted is, look, there's a container here that comes with the plastic chips that you use for the game. The container itself is made out of plastic. The cards themselves are made out of plastic. The box for the cards, rather than having a simple kind of paper band around them, it's a fully formed kind of plastic box. Do you think that's a conversation we maybe need to start having with ourselves before it becomes a standard,
Absolutely. And I don't want to, be the person to be accused of throwing stones or anything, because there's lots of things that need to be done. But I think that if the board gamers decided to start, voting with their feet or their credit cards and purchasing games that were more wood-based. For example, is it Junkyard's got a plastic version and a wooden version, right?
Yeah.
Buy the wooden version. And, we talk about printing in China, but actually China gets quite a bad rep sometimes because China plants millions of trees.
Yeah, it does.
Specific. It's a $1 billion, it's $1 billion industry. Well, not $1 billion project every year to replant the trees to offset the amount of paper and cardboard that they use in their factories, which is amazing. And people don't talk about that enough because I think that's really impressive.
I think China's kind of looked as as the kind of the fence. It's like all the countries are kind of shoplifting stuff and they're giving it to China to sell on, and then the police turn up at China's door and going, "You're doing all these bad things," and they're like going, "Well, kind of, maybe I am, but also at the same time, I would be doing this if people weren't sending me all this stuff, to kind of sort of
absolutely out." Right, and I think in many instances there's we can be thinking as board games designers of how can we make this out of a more sustainable format, or can we use wood here, can we use tokens here, can we use paper here? Is this something we could ask the gamers at home to use a token for instead? Is this something we could ask the gamers at home to use dice for instead? And tabletop RPGs are a great example of aren't they? Because look at D&D. I mean, you play in D&D, you can have like all the minis and everything like that, but theoretically you can play it with the Player's Handbook, the Dungeons Master's Guide, and then just a load of paper and pens and some dice.
Yeah, I heard.
And the possibilities of that game are almost endless.
Yeah, I heard something interesting the other day. I think it was Dan Hughes. Just the other day was talking, I think it was on the Guild with Ben Maddox, about Games Workshop's kind of business model and how they had to look at changing their business model quite dramatically, because what was happening was they were selling people kind of all of these armies that they were using, but then once people got to a certain size of armies, they weren't buying any more product because they pretty much had everything that they needed, and they were just, they were painting the minis and then they were just playing with the same things. And it was a case of, they were saying, well, the way that Games Workshop had to almost kind of create a hostile environment for these players in order to attract new people who were then going to go and kind of purchase things. I've always wondered about a game company that basically uses a generic kind of set of pieces and maybe releases like it could be a linen cover for a board or something like that, and what you do is when you get the game, you get the linen cover of the board to put on top of it, and then you can use the pieces to represent the tokens and kind of play it that way. And I think I think that's a way forward. What about because one thing that's been announced by Simon was, and I'm going to get this completely wrong, is Tambura, I think it was called, which is basically like an interactive kind of electronic mat. But the applications for that, while they seem to be kind of, you can now completely electrolyze your game, there's also kind of options there to basically be able to have like a generic map and then have different games kind of played off that, which I thought was kind of interesting. But I don't see a lot of discussions about it, which is why I kind of brought it up with yourself, in terms of the environmental impact on continually making lots and lots of plastic and not looking at our sustainability and our environmental policies.
Yeah, and I think, this is absolutely something that if you just do a back of the envelope calculation of, how many games get sold on Kickstarter every year and how much of that is made, then that's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, the caveat to that is that if these are games that are played regularly and kept in the house and reused and recycled, as in what I meant, give to other players and like repurposed, which board gamers do a really, really good job of, right?
Yes.
I think, that's a really powerful way. And, I don't want to be the person that's the killjoy and saying all that, but rather, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, it's a conversation that needs to take place, right? And it's not about pointing fingers, and it's not about saying, you do this, you don't do that. But it's hey people, have we thought about this? And, often what happens in those situations is that somebody comes up with an idea, an innovation that then makes the whole industry even better than it was before, right?
Yes.
So if thinking about that, and I guess when we design with Carbon City Zero, we're trying to be as sustainable as possible, keeping it to minimum components, trying to avoid plastic wrapping where we can, but then giving the caveat that when people get the game, it might be slightly battered, right? Because it's not got a plastic wrapper on it, but that's the price that you pay for not having a plastic wrapper. So, thinking about those little things that you're willing to overlook or that you're willing to concede on in order to have maybe a great environmental game would be really good.
So the rumours about you giving people a free panda with every copy, that's not true.
Sadly, grossly not true.
As long I was just thinking, because bamboo. I mean, everything seems to be made out of bamboo nowadays. You get in clothing. I just thought, you might. It'd be an interesting thing, free panda with our environmental game, just to kind of see people's reactions, because I would stir it up. That's what I would do. I would.
No, and it's really interesting that you said environmental game as well, because what we're really trying to do is that people see this as a game first. So, that it's not this is trying to teach us a message. It's this looks like a really cool game. And we've got we've got amazing artwork. Like, I'm obviously going to say that, but it looks really good. So, hopefully it's this thing where people play it and pick it up and they go, oh, this is really good. It's got a really nice mechanic. It's really fun to play. And, oh, hold on a second. I think I've just had a conversation about what it means to be a zero carbon city. How did that happen? That's what we're really looking for, rather than I'm going to play this worthy game about being a zero carbon city. It's not like that at all. It's look at that artwork, look at that gameplay, let's play it, and then wow, we've had a conversation as a result of it. Well,
going back to pandemic, that did a really good kind of way of teaching people potentially how about, as you said, how about infectious diseases spread and things like that anyway. So it's not a case that it's kind of almost promoting conversation about a subject through stealth, so that people end up talking about it, but it's not something that feels kind of tacked on. It's
absolutely.
Not like
science through stealth. That's what we're all about.
That is the name of that is actually the name of my my second album for my synth pop band. In terms of with you touching on kind of science and the gamification of it, is there educational? Over and above this, is there kind of educational kind of applications for something like this? Could you be...
So I think, it's a really interesting question. I think the thing is with games, right, in an educational capacity, and we've done a lot of work working in schools with games, you need to think about the actual limitations of the games. So you're going into a school environment, there's going to be X number of children in the class, you're going to have 50 minutes to play the game, you're going to need to teach them how to play the game. You're going to need to play the game. And then in order to really have any meaningful discussion, you're going to need to have a debrief afterwards as well. You need to do all of that in 50 minutes. Or, you might get a double lesson, but that's quite rare to do. So it's really thinking about what games can you use in those environments. Great examples would be the flux variations from Looney Labs, right? Like maths flux, chemistry flux, physics flux.
Yeah.
But other games like, if we're thinking about like numeracy or literacy, think games like Bananagrams and things are really, really games that people can pick up really quickly, play, and then you can have a conversation and dialogue around as well. So we're really interested. What we'd love for Carbon City Zero is really actually as for the gaming community to be like, this is a cool game. Oh, and it's making me think about this.
Yeah.
But also for policymakers, for local councillors, for people who can make decisions in their personal and professional lives about carbon budgets, to play the game and go, oh, this is a great way to start talking about this issue. This is a great way to start thinking about what it means for my city that I live in or that I manage or that I'm a part of to be zero carbon. So as well as, potentially thinking about how to take it into schools and how teachers can use it as a learning resource, we hope for it to be more than that and for it to be, educational, but in a two-directional way and outside of the formal learning environments as well, which bring their own restrictions.
Yeah, I know that there's a company that specialises in using the Minecraft game in order to teach things, aspects of architecture and constructions and things like that. It's a fascinating way to do things. I've always wondered if almost like some kind of legacy mechanic with a game, because you were young, I was young. I remember being at primary school, especially maybe primary 5, 6 and 7, where there would be like a class project for, the term. And I would always wonder
the Tudors, the Egyptians,
the Romans,
the Victorians.
The Romans, roads, the sea, space, whiskey. But I don't know if that was just my teacher at the time, because they liked to sample it an awful lot. Friday afternoon, let's get this done, class. And there we go. But I'd always wonder if the impact of some kind of legacy game where the kids, as they were learning stuff, were taking kind of decisions which then built upon the continual kind of game itself. So at the end of the 13 weeks kind of term, then they would have a game that they would play. I'm thinking, something like Charterstone or something like that, where it doesn't have to be incredibly complicated, but it can be something that can be quite interesting to do. That's the thunder and lightning on, basically. I don't know if you can hear that in the background, Sam.
No, I can hear it absolutely. Yeah. So in the northwest of England, we had it about earlier on in the day, and it was quite extreme.
Yes. But yeah, no, I can kind of see things like that anyway. But you said that if you've got kind of details for the game, as we say, have you got kind of like ideas of prices and launches on the Kickstarter and everything like that at all?
Yeah, so we're hoping for the Kickstarter to go live around the week beginning the 8th of September.
Okay.
If people want updates of the game, they can go to the 1010 Climate Action website and sign up for the newsletter. All the details will be there. And we're still working out price points exactly. But what we're really, really keen on is making it a game that most people will be able to afford.
Cool.
So the other thing to say is that we're not making any money from the game. Mm-hmm. So all of the profits of the game we're using to buy more copies of the game, which we're then going to give to local community groups and schools so that they can then play the game themselves as well. One cool thing I'll tell you about that we are certain about is one of the pledge levels. So for a certain amount of money, we're going to encourage and invite cities to bid to be an actual card in the game. So our artist will design your city in the style of the game, and then your city will feature permanently in every single deck of cards. So, if you want to be Edinburgh, if you want to be Bristol, if you want to be Manchester. So really to try and simulate this real race that's going on to be the UK's first zero carbon city. And we think that's a really nice pledge level that we can hopefully generate a bit of excitement and interest and healthy competition around.
Is there a bow tie pledge level?
Is there a bow tie pledge level? Maybe we could put something crazy on the top, where hand designed bow tie or something. I'll come and tie a bow tie for you. I want something like you have to have something like that with the game's logo on it. I think that would be amazing. We could maybe talk to our designer about it. the graphic designer. That'd be quite nice.
That would be quite cool. Thank you very, very much for your time. I know it's maybe not been gamey enough for everybody, but it has, so stop it. But I really appreciate you coming on, and I can only wish you best.
Thanks so much for having me.
I can only wish you best of luck with the campaign. Obviously, we will make sure that we shall spread the word far and wide when it goes live on September the 8th.
Thanks, Richard.
And if people want to, if they've listened along tonight and they said, well, I want to kind of keep an eye on what this gentleman is up to, where do you exist on the internet webs? How do we find you?
Well, you can go to my personal website, which is www.samillingworth.com. That's www.samillingworth.com. Find me on Twitter at Sam Illingworth. Or probably of more interest, you can go to the Manchester Game Studies Network, which is just manchestergamestudies.org. That's manchestergamestudies.org. And you can sign up for our newsletter. We have several events going on throughout the year that members of the public are really welcome to come along and join in with. Many blog posts, book reviews. And if you want to get in touch or even think about joining the network as well, we'd really like to hear from you. You can read Paul and me every month in Tabletop Gaming magazine. And Paul and I will also be at Tabletop Gaming Live at the end of September with some of our colleagues from 1010 Climate Action to talk to the Denzians of the Ali Pali about Carbon City Zero and what it means to develop a game around climate change.
That sounds fantastic. As I say, we'll make sure that we take all of these links and we put them in the show notes so that we have got notes to show. If you'd like to keep an eye on what we're up to, then just go to the internet webs and search for We're Not Wizards. And you will find us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and our website, which is we'renotwizards.com, and our blog, which is we'renotwizards.blogspot.com, where we're continuing to write more and more things. Previews and sideways glances and opinion pieces, and generally old men like me shouting at clouds. If you've enjoyed what you've listened to tonight, there's a couple of things that you can do. You can tell somebody else about us, because we just like pandemic, we spread like an unwanted virus, with no cure. And the other thing that you can do is you can go to Apple Podcasts and you can, drop us a subscription, or you can drop us a rating, or you can drop us a review. And if you are going to be doing any of those things, remember, do not give us 10 stars, because it makes us big-headed. But at the same time, do not give us 1 star, because it maketh us cry. Give us something in the middle, like a 5, because it's average. And we're just a little bit average. But the person who's not been average tonight is rather wonderful. The rather fantastic Doctor, because I've got to put that in there, Sam Illingworth.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much. There's only 2 more things to do. The first thing is to remember that we're many things, but we're not wizards. Are we wizards, Sam?
We are certainly not wizards.
Definitely not. Unless it's climate wizards. Then I guess that's kind of acceptable. And the other thing is to say goodbye. So it's a goodbye from Sam. Say goodbye, Sam.
Goodbye.
And it's a goodbye from me. Remember, stay safe, roll 6s, make something awful, and check out Carbon City 0 when it's out in September. And because it'll be cool and it'll be fun. And we might even write some stuff about it as well. So there you go. But until the next time, goodbye.
A wizard is never late. Nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.